Okay, Dave, thank you very much. You can start.
All right, thank you. And thank you for the invitation. Today, I'm going to explain how Darwin's theory of sexual selection can be used to better understand how the magnitude of evolved sex differences can vary across contexts and vary across time. So, as you know, sexual selection involves competition for mate and mate choices, as we see there with the peacock, and that results in the exaggeration of the traits that are associated with competition in choice, as in the peacock's train, that is associated with female choice and is correlated with the male's immune functions. This leads to sex differences that we see in the first pair of distributions there, where the trait of one sex is larger than that of the other sex. What's interesting about these traits is that they are not only exaggerated, but they signal resilience in the face of stressors such as parasites, nutritional stress, extreme social competition. And, or another way of saying it, their expression is dependent on the health and condition of the individual. One result is that the magnitude of the sex differences is predicted to decrease, as we see in the second group of distributions there, under stressful conditions, and then increase in more optimal conditions. So, in other words, even though there are evolved sex differences, we anticipate that the magnitude of these differences is going to be variable and fluctuate with current conditions and conditions while individuals are growing up. So here is the a study we recently published looking at height and weight. So for people, men's height and their weight, especially upper body lean muscle mass, are sexually selected. They're related to male on male physical competition and female choice. If the hypothesis that these sexually selected traits are sensitive to conditions is correct, then improvements in health should result in larger sex differences, or poorer health, smaller sex differences. So in the top figures, we see on the x-axis the Human Development Index, which is a good indicator of nutritional risk for the population, disease burden, excess social stressors, and so forth. Higher scores are better conditions. And as we see, as this is across countries here, as we see, as we move from lower HDI or poorer conditions to better conditions, the magnitude of the sex difference in height increases, and the magnitude of the sex difference in weight increases as well. For this analysis, we excluded individuals who would be considered obese. So it's probably mostly lean muscle mass, bone mass, etc. The bottom figure shows data from about 50,000 people, cross-sectional study in the UK. These are individuals born between 1905 and 1958. During this time, living conditions had improved substantially in the UK. So people born in 1905, men had an 11 centimeter advantage in height. For those born in 1958, they had a 15 centimeter advantage in height. So men's height gained 36%. Across these two analyses and another analysis that I'm not presenting here, we see that improvements in living conditions resulted in height gains that were twice as rapid in men than in women. So that's interesting. But it'd be even more interesting if we see sex differences in other areas, such as cognitive abilities. And so in these upcoming slides, I'm going to be focusing on men's advantage in visual spatial abilities and women's advantage in episodic uh, memory, which is memory for personal experiences, and verbal memory, such as remembering lists of words. So these are data from Sweden. The top figure there shows that in Sweden, height increased from 1909 to 1969. This is date of birth here. So in 1909, men were about 10 centimeters taller than women. And in those born in 69, they wound up about 15 centimeters taller than women, very similar to what we saw with the UK data. Now, what's even more interesting, if we look at individuals across these same cohorts, we see with the first, with the bottom figures, the leftmost one is a measure of men's visual spatial abilities. The x-axis is year of birth, and the y-axis is just scores on that. And we see that earlier born folks, not much of a sex difference, but a male advantage, it emerges for later born cohorts. This is not a very good measure of visual spatial ability, so the effect size is generally small. I think we would get larger effects if we had a better measure, as I'll show you here in a bit. But in any case, the other two measures show women's episodic memory and verbal memory. And as we'll see, with those born early in the 20th century, there's no sex difference. But as conditions improved over time in Sweden, the female advantage emerged and then got larger with more recent cohorts. So showing the same pattern as we see with height, but now we're showing differential effects for different cognitive abilities. Those that normally favor men are getting bigger over time. Those that normally favor women are getting bigger over time as well. So it's not just a male specific effect. So here we have a similar analysis looking at memory for personal experiences, episodic memory again, and verbal memory. This is a meta-analysis of a variety of studies that have looked at these constructs across countries, largely. The x-axis on those figures there represent various indices of that would be correlated with well-being, such as gross domestic product, years of education, and so forth. Two interesting effects here. One is that in the poorest conditions, so the conditions closer to the y-axis there's no significant sex differences. We don't have the typical female advantage. As living conditions improved, women gained more on these measures, especially for verbal memory, than men did. And now a sex difference emerges in the healthiest populations. So this is a study in several studies in Denmark and Sweden. In Denmark, we're looking at conscripts. So these are men drafted into the military, and ability gains from 1969 to 1979. This is a time period when heights were still increasing in Denmark. And the top figure there, in the top right, we see that it's a bit hard to read, but in any case, the line that shows the steepest slope there is geometric figures, a measure of visual spatial abilities. So a measure that men typically do better on relative to women is gaining the most within men. Measures of various verbal abilities that women sometimes do better on, or there's no sex difference on, they gain as well with the gains in height, but they don't gain as much as the visual spatial abilities. So within sex, it's not that all cognitive abilities are increasing at the same rate as height increases, but those that typically favor one sex or the other and are related to sexual selection and related processes are gaining the most. We see a similar effect in Sweden. So again, same cohorts, 69 to 79 military recruits. The first figure there to the bottom left shows across cohort gains. The one line that sticks out above all the others is again visual spatial abilities. They gained the most as these men gained in height. The other abilities were like verbal and some other measures. The one that's dropping is technical abilities, so they don't know how to change tires anymore, apparently. But the same pattern. This visual spatial ability gains really stand out as height increases. Now, the figure next to it, bottom right, shows us later cohorts. So this is after height gains had peaked in Sweden. So we're not seeing the same processes there. But now the men were going to school for about 3 years longer or so. So we're getting an educational effect. And as we'll see, all of the skills, except the technical ones at the bottom there, are getting better. But the visual spatial skills aren't sticking out like it did for the Danish men and the earlier cohorts of Swedish men. So there's an educational effect there that is improving everything at about the same rate. But if we just look at height, it depends on the skill. Visual spatial in particular are getting picked up. Okay, so I wanted to find it. It's hard to do these types of long-term studies. With height, it's easy because it's the same thing for everybody, no matter when you were born. For cognitive measures, a lot of the tests haven't been around for a while, and sometimes some tests that have the same name actually have different types of items. So I found an old test called Spatial Relations from Thurstone's Primary Mental Abilities that has been given since the 1920s, I think, or early 1930s. And so it's been around quite a while. The stimuli are pretty consistent across the years, focused on a tight age range, 12 to 19-year-olds, so adolescents, born between 1929 and 2005, and all in the U.S. There were substantial height gains during this time, especially up through like the 1990s, 2000 or so. So I found 15 studies. That's all there is with this test, I'm pretty sure, and did a meta-analysis looking at weighted effect sizes. And we see that people born around 1930, boys have about a 0.4 standard deviation advantage over same age girls. Those born in 1960, that advantage increases to 0.5 standard deviations. And those born in 1990, it's about a 0.65 standard deviation advantage. This latter effect, though, I'm not sure about because they were high-end samples, which may have distorted the results. So if we just combine everybody born around 1960 or later, we have that one dot there, and that's about a 0.55 standard deviation difference. So over time, with the same test, we're seeing about a 38% increase in boys' advantage in visual spatial abilities. The Seattle longitudinal study is very interesting. It's a cross-sequential study, so it has adults that are assessed every 7 years, and from birth cohorts starting all the way back to the early part of the 20th century through the latter part of the 20th century. So a lot of interesting data there. It looked at two measures: cube comparison in verbal memory. One favors men, one favors women. On the x-axis, on the bottom figure, that is birth cohort. Anything above 0 is an advantage for males. Anything below 0 is an advantage for females. The top part of the figure is spatial ability. The bottom part is verbal memory. And we'll see for the guys anyway, though, and the lines are assessment times. So the solid line there are individuals all assessed at the same time, but born in different years. Anyway, we can see the overall trend. For those born early in the 19th century, there's not much of a sex difference there, a little bit of a male advantage, but I doubt it would be significant. And as we move to later cohorts, as living conditions in the U.S. were improving dramatically, we get up to about a 0.5 standard deviation male advantage. However, we didn't really see the same pattern with women. They were advantaged in verbal memory throughout all of these cohorts, about a half a standard deviation or so. I'm not exactly sure what's up with that. We need to look at these data a little more closely. I've requested it several times to do the appropriate analyses to look at these patterns, but so far they've turned us down, but I'll try again later. In any case, these results are confounded with age. The earlier born folks are obviously older when they're assessed. And there's also, for the older folks, there are sex differences in brain aging that need to be adjusted for in some way. But in any case, at least for the visual spatial abilities, it's very consistent with the other studies. Now, what about behavioral sex differences? This is a really interesting set of studies done looking at early nutritional stressors. So in species with intense male-male competition, there's typically more aggressive behavior, including rough and tumble play during males than females' early development. Very common finding there across species. So Barrett and colleagues here had a study where lower income Guatemalan children were either nutritionally stressed, they're all nutritionally stressed, but some of them received nutritional supplements. And then they were assessed. They had observers as well as quantitative measures, a variety of different ways to look at these kids' social behaviors. So the top figure there, the 0 means that there's no difference between nutritionally stressed individuals and nutritionally supplemented individuals of the same sex. So we see that relative to nutritionally stressed individuals, the supplemented boys were described as and behaved. They're more physically aggressive, engage in more rough and tumble play, and were more assertive in their social interactions there. So about moderate effects, half standard deviation or so. None of the effects for girls were significant, so it's all at the 0 there. The bottom figure shows behavior during a competitive game and looked at a variety of measures there. I have 2 of them there. We see that the nutritionally supplemented boys were observed to be more excited, more engaged in the game, more competitive in the game than the nutritionally stressed boys. The nutritionally stressed boys, the only difference there was they were more fearful during the competitions than were their supplemented peers, and even more fearful than girls who were nutritionally stressed. So the nutritional supplements had consistent effects on boys' competitive behavior, motivation, focus, rough and tumble play, and so forth, but had very little effect on these same behaviors in girls. So men and women differ in height and lean muscle mass. They also differ in cardiovascular fitness, and the fitness differences, cardiovascular and some other differences like running speed, are evident in childhood. So this is a study done in rural China, looking at physical fitness of boys and girls, children and adolescents combined, who some of whom were infected with a parasitic disease, such as the worm there in the inset, and some of which weren't. The task there on the y-axis is a shuttle run. It's like a 20-meter gap, and you have 10 minutes or 5 minutes or whatever, and you just run back and forth. And it's a very easy to do, and it's a very good measure of cardiovascular fitness. And we see that the fitness levels of boys are higher than girls overall, which is a standard finding here. The interesting finding is that the uninfected and the infected girls didn't really differ much in fitness. But if we look at the boys, the infected boys took a big hit in fitness. They were disadvantaged by a fair amount relative to their uninfected peers. The y-axis names are just names of um, uh, different worms, basically. So this is looking at women with nutritional deficiencies, with anorexia nervosa. So you have restricted calorie intake, we have restricted nutritional intake, and we have a low body mass index, so they're very thin. And some interesting studies here. There more needs to be done, but they seem to lose, particularly in areas that involve social information processing rather than, say, reasoning about physical things. The zero, again, means the difference between individuals in the first part of the graph, individuals with acute anorexia nervosa and normal weight women. So we'll see there that women who aren't eating much and have a low BMI have about a 1 standard deviation deficit relative to other women in theory of mind. That's the ability to make inferences about the thoughts or emotional states of others. They also have, 0.6 standard deviation deficit in face processing. That's identifying the emotional expression in a face. Women who have recovered, they're still anorexic, but they're now eating properly, and their weight is now in the average range. We see that these deficits are ameliorated to some extent. Now, a lot of these women probably have premorbid social cognitive deficits, so probably they're getting kind of back to their baseline here. But there's a clear difference between the acute and recovered phase. The BN is bulimia nervosa. These women have some of the same issues, psychological issues, as women with anorexia, but they don't have the extreme weight loss and nutritional deficits. They're typically normal weight. You see that they just have some minor deficits there. So the implication is that the magnitude of evolved sex differences, many people think of it as deterministic. It's a kind of a fixed sort of thing. Well, if it's evolved, it has a genetic basis to it, then it's going to be whatever size it's going to be. And that's not the case. The magnitude of these sex differences is predicted to increase with reductions in nutritional infectious, and social stressors. So as developmental conditions get better and current conditions are good, we expect sex differences in whatever traits we're thinking about to be larger in those conditions. So as a recap, height is a good indicator of exposure to these stressors, very, very good population marker. This increased substantively in the 20th century in developed nations. Okay, that's well documented. Height is still increasing in many developing nations today. As population height increased, both men and women got taller, but the men gained at about twice the rate as women, and so the average sex difference increased. The same is true today. I didn't show you this, but we have some data on the HDI and changes, national level changes in the HDI from 1990 to 2020, and we show the same effect. Nations that improved living conditions, height increased, and the male advantage in height increased as well. So it's not just about height, though. It looks as if women's advantage in verbal abilities, memory, maybe social cognitive processing, as I showed you with the women with anorexia, get better as stressful conditions recede. Men's visual spatial abilities get better when they're living in better conditions. Common energy demanding behavioral sex differences, rough and tumble play, competitiveness, and so forth are the smallest in nutritionally stressed boys. Nutritionally stressed boys are even lower than nutritionally stressed girls. So these sex-specific kind of, I can't see the end there, but these sex-specific variations in the magnitude of sex differences are, it doesn't make sense in terms of any sociological theory or tabula rasa view of the origin of sex differences, but it follows from evolutionary theory, and in particular from the prediction that exaggerated sexually selected traits are condition dependent, that they have evolved to be sensitive to environmental conditions in a way that signals the health of the bearer of those traits. And that's it. We've got 2 minutes.
Very much, Dave. Thank
All
you
right.
very much.
Thank you.
Appreciate a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time and your presentation. We learned a
Okay.
lot. Thank you very